My name is Ralph Williams. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Access to Holistic Productive Living, as well as the Outreach Coordinator for Promised Neighborhoods Coalition. The coalition consists of a variety of for and nonprofit entities that work on behalf of the District Heights, Suitland, and Forestville areas of Maryland. Thank you for joining us in this presentation. This presentation is going to be about underage drinking today. And how it looks in your community. Next slide, please. Okay, the problem. There is a national problem when regards to underage drinking. One thing about underage drinking is that it comes in a variety of instances, as well as how it substantiates and continues to perpetuate throughout our country. It's widespread. 35% of all 15-year-olds have drunk at least one alcoholic beverage, while 22% of 12 to 20-year-olds have drunk within the past month. This is, again, nationwide, and you have to think about different parts of the country that may have disparate issues in regards to that. When we talk about the widespread, you have a high concentration of underage drinking in rural areas as well as urban areas. So that keeps the number very high across the country. And the continuity and quantity, 14.2% of youth from ages 12 to 20 binge drink. And 3.7% of youth drink heavily. So there is a problem that exists today in that regards. But the problem statement is this, and this is something we're going to examine while we're doing this presentation, is underage drinking can be substantially reduced with interventions. What does that mean? We'll get to that shortly. Next slide, please. Let's cut for a second. I'm having some technical difficulties over here.
Go ahead.
Okay, this graph demonstrates the percentage of high school students who drank alcohol for the first time before 13 years of age. You'll see, this is for the state of Maryland. So you'll see right here, you have it color-coded for blue for Maryland, color-coded for Maryland and the United States. Red for the United States, this purple, bluish color for Maryland. You have about 23% total as far as drinking before the age of 13, where Maryland's a little higher than the national average. And also Maryland is higher than the national average as far as males are concerned in doing it, and substantially higher for female drinkers for the first time before age 13. Next slide. This graph, we have a percentage of high school students who had at least one drink of alcohol on at least one day. Basically meaning that is there a continuum as far as how much or how often they drink? Again, you can see the comparisons how Maryland is actually lower in this instance than the national average. Next slide. Okay, on this slide, again, we're still comparing the nation to the state of Maryland. Percent of high school students who have 5 or more drinks of alcohol in a row within a couple of hours, or at least once a day, or at least one day. That basically translates into either a binge drinking or some semblance of binge drinking. And as you see here on the graph, again, color-coded for blue being the state of Maryland and red being the United States, you have a substantial difference, particularly among males in the state of Maryland versus the national average for binge drinking. So evidently binge drinking, or the semblance thereof, does not really exist in the state of Maryland, as bad as it does nationwide. Next slide. Okay, percent of high school students who usually obtain alcohol they drank from someone giving it to them. This is either the shoulder tap or older friends passing on alcohol to younger people. This is a very interesting chart because you see that Maryland has a higher average of this than the national average, about 44% to 40%. But then as far as females are concerned, you have a much greater difference in about 48% to 46%. So it seems that we have a little bit of difference in that as far as attainability here in the state of Maryland versus the national average.
So you trying to say that women or the females are able to
Go
get
back.
alcohol more accessible than the guys?
Slightly more, and you would think just by a sociological basis that would exist. You know, given that you have women have can sometimes be a little bit more influential than young men when it comes to getting things they want, particularly at a younger age. Think about the difference between someone who is 21 trying to gain the affections of someone who's 17. You know, that could actually easily happen in the sense that you have this older person trying to get in good with someone younger just for the sake of getting alcohol and whatever else that may come from that. Next slide. Okay. Percent of high school students who drove when drinking alcohol one or more times. This is a very interesting, very serious one. This is one that is of importance throughout the United States. You see, though, that the United States and Maryland average are about the same at 8%, whereas in the United States it's a little higher at 9% of instances versus 8% for males, and it's, again, is even for female in the United States versus Maryland. Next slide. Now, one more interesting point for comparison. Percent of high school students who rode with a driver who had been drinking alcohol at one or more times. This goes into usually the typical high school weekend outing, sometimes your collegiate outings on the weekend, whereas you have, here in Maryland, have a much higher rate, well, not much, a pretty decent higher rate over the national average at 26% versus 24%, and a big gap in difference between males in the United States versus the state of Maryland. Next slide. Okay, how does this pertain to Prince George's County, our local home here? First of all, from an environmental perspective, but let me first, before I get into that, let me first add a caveat that a lot of this information is pertinent to the Suitland area of Prince George's County because that is our focus. So I want to make sure we have that. But there are actually four aspects as a continued slide after this: environment, public school suspensions, treatment rates, and drinking and driving. So the alcohol-related arrests, there were 25% of juveniles arrested for liquor law violations that were in the Suitland area only. Okay, and also this actually has a high impact on our public schools. Per 1,000 students, Forestville had 9.5% instances of public school suspension based on substance abuse, some type of substance-related suspension, as did Suitland High School, but much lower at 3.3%, and where the county average was 6.1%. So you see that the Forestville has a much higher rate than the county when this is concerned. And you see the numbers here. Forestville High with 7 actual suspensions from substance-related suspensions. Drew Freeman Middle with 7, and Walker Mill Middle with 6. Okay, alcohol, and let's talk about treatment rates. And one thing you mentioned in treatment rates are what we call alcohol-related mentions. Basically, you have a case that comes about and there is some type of alcohol instance related within the submitting somebody in for treatment. So that's what they mean by a mention. So there are a total of 5,600 cases reported for persons 12 through 25. In a 3-year period, though, 37 cases were youth 20 years old or younger, with 102 admissions from the Suitland area in 2010. The one thing that is of concern is that admissions for the state-supported programs for these type of admissions and treatments has actually decreased, but have been increasing in the Suitland area. Next slide, please. And then we'll have the fourth concern of drinking and driving. And luckily, that's the one good thing, is that we've had a decreased rate in county and Suitland area drinking and driving instances with youth. Next slide, please. Okay, nice little pie chart here. It's a breakdown of what happened. Let me talk about this real quick. This is a graph of a survey that was completed in 2013 with, let me make sure I get my acronyms correct here. The Maryland Substance Prevention Fund, Alcohol Prevention Initiative Suitland Youth and Young Adult Survey was proctored in 2013 about underage drinking in Suitland area. There are a certain amount of questions that are asked, and I'm going to go on and show a couple of slides about the questions that were asked in the survey. And in this group, there were a group of 30 actual interviewees, or subjects, however you want to say it. And 16 of the 30 expressed disapproval of underage drinking. However, 7 of those were unsure. Let's talk a little bit about this graph here. So one of the questions that came out was, how easy is it for youth to get alcohol in Suitland area? And again, these are peer-to-peer questions asked of children that are younger than 20 years old. So the biggest percentile was 27.1% of older friends getting their alcohol. The next was private parties at 22%, friends' homes at 20.3%, their own home at 16.9%, and family events actually was 13.6%. Next slide. So here we have a double graph here. Just before I start, I'll just go ahead and express the questions. How much alcohol is used? How accepted is alcohol use in Suitland among youth and young adults? And then the second one is, what are the worst punishments for underage drinking? When asked how accepted alcohol use is in Suitland among youth and young adults, 23 actually did not respond. That's this graph right here. Versus the 4 that answered mostly social. Now that's actually very important, because a non-response is, you can determine it any such way, but it could mean that these youth were a little intimidated about how to answer honestly the question that was posed to them. So that's something we need to consider. How open are we to discussing alcohol problems with our youth, and how much are they confused by what's considered socially acceptable and not. So similar numbers answered that alcohol use targeting youth or young adults is promoted or not promoted in Suitland. Of the respondents, 14 felt that there were a moderate or great risk to their overall health and their achievements. 18 underage youth being suspended from school. These are the things that they considered a harsh punishment. 18 of those saying that being suspended from school was a harsh punishment. 14 said getting arrested, and 10 considered going to jail. Those are the things they considered were some of the penalties for underage drinking. When asked how much people risk harming themselves physically and other ways by binge drinking once or twice a week, 13 responded moderate or high or great risk. Only 5 agree that alcohol had a negative effect on their lives. So that's an interesting concept too. So the second graph, what are the worst punishments? That goes, everyone's concerned most about being arrested and then jail and then school suspension. So I guess they actually understand to a degree of what the punishments involved with underage drinking can entail, or at least may possibly entail for them if the consequences are great. Okay. All right. In 2013, 29 7th graders were asked the number of times they drank alcohol in the past 30 days. 21.4% drank 1 to 9 times. However, no student reported using alcohol more than 1 to 9 times. In other words, there were none of the students in this survey were in that binge to constant drinking period. 66.7% or 19 students perceive drinking alcohol as moderate to great risk. That number lowers as students got older, however. So as they got older, 54% for 9th graders and 10th graders and 76.9% of 11th graders. So basically that says that initially as they're younger, they realize it's a great risk, but they start to get into the realm of, oh, it's okay, it's not a big deal when they get into high school. But also what I didn't have it written in here was at senior year, in 12th grade, 50% of the students thought there was great risk in drinking underage. So again, this is the graph showing how many of these students drank within 30 days. You see a substantial number that did not, at 78.6%. Okay, I do not have the acronym for this. It's but basically it's another survey that was conducted in, I believe, 2010, where we talked to adults about drinking and drinking habits in Suitland. And there were 104 that were interviewed, 2/3 of which were unemployed at the time of the survey, and 40% of the responders were 18 to 25, 16% were 26 to 29 years of age, and 24% were 30 years and older. 19 did not report an age, 19% I should say. 41% of the respondents stated that they have not drunk alcohol in the past 30 days, and 43% reported that they had at least one drink in that period, while 2/3 replied that drinking is a great to moderate risk to their health and life goals. So you're looking at a group of people who were predominantly unemployed. These were job seekers, and they were very reticent about drinking more than they feel was moderate or great. So on this chart, we have what adults perceived as how youth get their alcohol. And you'll see that 71% perceived that it was from older friends, 65% from private parties, 62% from friends' homes, 55 actually percent said home, and 54% from other youth. Now this was not, this survey, well, this question was surveyed as an and or, as opposed to just check only one box. So people were allowed to have multiple answers for what they perceive for youth obtaining alcohol. This is also interesting, is that 31 of them believe that underage youth know how to purchase alcohol, and 47% report they believe it's easy for them to get alcohol in the Suitland area. 36% said that alcohol is mostly social in Suitland, while 10% answered it's cool, everybody drinks. 59% feel that youth alcohol consumption is promoted in Suitland. That's pretty interesting too. Those are actually adults saying that, so we have a interesting dynamic there. Next slide. So what are solutions? What can be done to help our youth navigate through the minefield of underage drinking in our area? Well, the simple answer to that is interventions. That doesn't necessarily mean anything like you see in a TV show where they grab everybody in a room and they tell them how they feel and how they need to interact and how they need to change. There are different ways of creating interventions, and we'll demonstrate some of those. One is called environmental interventions. And environmental interventions are basically interventions that pertain to the stores, the businesses, the social dynamic in where everyone lives. This approach makes alcohol hard to get, for example, by raising the price of alcohol and keeping the minimum drinking age at 21, enacting zero tolerance laws that outlaw driving after any amount of drinking for people under 21 also can prevent problems. Now, I took a picture. We put this picture in here to kind of demonstrate how this looks like a store in the Suitland area, where you have up to 40 or 50 ads covering a window. You can't even see what's inside the store because there's so many ads on the window showing what is on sale and what items they have in the store. An environmental intervention for this might be through some type of policy to prohibit these type of things on our stores. Next slide. There's also school-based interventions. Next slide. So, school-based interventions usually pertain to programs that provide students with the knowledge, skills, motivation, and opportunities they need to maintain alcohol-free. In 2017, October 27th, I'm sorry, Promise Neighborhoods Drug-Free Coalition visited Forestville Academy, where we actually worked and gave them a simulated drunk driving, I don't want to call it a test, but it was called an activity. You'll see in this bottom corner of the slide the goggles that are put onto the students as they go through that mechanism. And also, it's a real car, but at the bottom of the car are sliders that navigate the wheels automatically through the computer based on how much they create a false environment for drunken driving. Next slide. There's also, of course, family-based interventions. Next slide. Family-based interventions are the most important because these are the efforts to empower parents to set and enforce clear rules against drinking, as well as improve communication between children and parents about alcohol. Very important. Parents probably play the biggest role in this intervention because parents can talk about the dangers of drinking, drinking responsibly if they choose to drink, serving as positive role models in general, not making alcohol available to students, getting to know their children's friends is very important, having regular conversations about life in general, connecting with other parents so that everybody's on the same page about sending clear messages about the importance of not drinking alcohol, period, and supervising all parties to make sure that there is no alcohol involved. That's very important. We have a lot of times where young adults have parties while parents are out of town, and they'll find a way to have alcohol at the parties. These parties need to be supervised. And finally, encouraging kids to participate in healthy and fun activities that do not involve alcohol. We all know that as we're younger, we get involved in a lot of activities that don't have alcohol. At the same time, as we get older, those instances change, but at the same time, they don't. So we need to introduce to families that there are other things to do besides getting an ice cold drink. Next slide. There's nothing that makes you more insane than family, or more happy, or more exasperated, or more secure. Again, the biggest intervention and most important intervention that involves with reducing youth underage drinking is intervention with the family. That's the most immediate, that's the most responsive, that's the most interactive. So if we can get our people and our whole families and our communities engaged into more parental interventions pertaining to this, examine these issues as a family, we can reduce these instances and these rates a lot more than we already have. Next slide. That is it. Thank you for your time.
My name is Richard Moody, and I'm the supervisor for Student Affairs, Safe and Drug-Free Schools for Prince George's County. And if you don't know, one of the roles that I have in the county is when students get caught, like Ralph was talking about, when they drink or they use drugs or alcohol or tobacco, they actually have to come through our office, and then we probably send them to the health department where they have to receive counseling. After they receive the counseling, then they're allowed to come back to school. So this is from a presentation that I did for Psych Services a little bit, maybe like 5 or 6 months ago. The data is not, hasn't been updated since around Christmas time. So some of the numbers that I'm going to share with you, you can probably think of doubling those numbers. But what we're seeing in terms of trends, in the last 2 school years, we've had cigarette referrals. Most of the cigarette referrals have been for middle school students. E-cigarettes, increasingly popular. Other drug use is down. And I did see some data from DHMH yesterday. And I think that's a trend around the state. But that's not to be confused with marijuana is not still the most popular drug. I mean, it is. And those are the referrals that we get. Let me go back. This to date, and this again was about 3-4 months ago. To date, we have had in our office 343 alcohol, tobacco, and other drug referrals. So right now that number is probably more like 7. 263 were first time, 48 were second time, and there have been 32 tobacco referrals. So I don't see tobacco as like the biggest issue in the county. Clearly marijuana is. The issue with tobacco is with middle school students. So that's where the problem is there. Other trends, marijuana is the drug of choice among PGCPS students. Alcohol is a close second. We haven't had nearly as many alcohol referrals as we have had for marijuana. We're not seeing this huge surge of use in things like ecstasy, Molly, this practice of waxing, which is big in California, heroin, meth. We're not really seeing a lot of that. While we haven't seen even widespread opiate use.
What's waxing?
You ever watch Snoop Dogg?
No.
Okay. You actually, it's like a liquid marijuana, and it's very potent. And it looks like earwax, but you have to mix it with something like butane. And that's the reason why they've had like some houses that have blown up in California, because the people have been, but I'm not seeing that. But it's just, things change every day. Today it's waxing.
So how do they get high off of that? Or is the thrill of it?
Well, it's like a marijuana high, only it's just way stronger.
And you smoke it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll smoke it. Yeah, you could put it on the end of a, this is really being filmed, hang on. You can put it on the end of a marijuana joint, or or cigarette, any number of ways. Yeah, but again, that's not something that we're seeing here, and we're definitely not seeing that with kids. Again, I was trying to describe that we haven't seen widespread opiate use, and I know that that's a big issue in the country and in some other counties. We're not really seeing that. What we're seeing is marijuana. But, I have heard reports that sometimes when our kids are actually tested, that they do show up with other things in their tox screens. That has happened. And synthetic marijuana, with its various names, K2, whatever, is also being used and among students, middle school and high school students.
That's not on the rise anymore. Is it coming back down? It's not on the rise anymore, is it? K2 and all that.
I hadn't heard about it as much in the last few years as I have this year.
Right.
This year I've heard like maybe 5 or 6.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I hadn't heard anything in like the last couple of years. Just trying to think what else. One of the things that I shared with the school psychologist is moving forward and what kind of things that we can do. And Ralph was talking about interventions and school-based interventions. There is something called the Life Skills Training Program. It's been around for a number of years. I think some of you have heard of it. We did get a grant from the University of Colorado to continue that. So that will be continued in middle schools, and the curriculum will be delivered through the health education teachers. And we're actually going to train them in April. I think that people need to advocate in the community for school-based programs such as the Student Assistance Program. And I know people have been familiar with that for years. But it barely exists. There's not a really big push for it. And that's the kind of program that really needs to come back. I shared with them that in the 2014 Maryland Tobacco Youth Risk Behavior Survey was administered last fall. And the results are supposed to be released by the CDC. I believe they're being released tomorrow on the 22nd. So I would encourage anybody to get that data. Ralph, take a look at it. what's really good about it is they've broken the data down by county. So there's going to be PG data, there'll be Baltimore City data, there'll be Anne Arundel County data, and you can make whatever kind of comparisons you want. It won't go by school. So you'll never see Suitland or Northwestern, but it does go by county. And that's grades 6 through 12, so it's middle school and high school. On our end in the school system, I really recommended that we streamline this whole referral process for alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. And that's probably got to be, something that Richard Moody needs to work on. Possibly make non-administrative alcohol, tobacco, and drug referrals through things like SIT or SST, which are already in the schools. And follow up with students returning to school from a suspension related to alcohol or other drugs. So those are just some recommendations that I made to the school system as we pretty much move forward. And that's pretty much all the info that I was planning to share.
So what is the, I won't say punishment, but how are the students handled with marijuana, especially when marijuana is now being put into the e-cigarettes?
According to the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook, if a child is found to be in violation of the school system's code for alcohol or other drugs, they can be given what's called the alternative to expulsion, which means the school has the right to move forward with the request for an expulsion. That child should, if it's their first time, they need to go to counseling 2 times. If it's their second time, they need to go 4 times. If they are not compliant after 6 weeks, then my office issues a letter of noncompliance, and the school could move forward with that expulsion.
How long do they have to, or once they get the information, how long do they have to?
They have to, and I also want to say that there is an automatic suspension. So even though you're not getting expelled, you are going to be suspended for 3 to 5 days. They have to make the appointment. They don't have to go, but they have to make the appointment and prove that they've made it before they can return to school after that 3 to 5 day suspension. So they have 3 to 5 days to make their appointment, even if it's just the first one. But they have 4 weeks to actually, depending on how backed up the health department is, or the youth family services bureaus, or Dr. Sargent, District Heights, they may not get them in 5 days, but they have to make that appointment in 5 days.
Yeah, when the parents call, I work with Beverly.
Yeah.
And when they call, it's usually like when they're going back to school, and it's like last minute.
Yeah.
They don't, the parents don't take it seriously.
Yeah, and you guys are really pretty good, because most of those agencies, when they see the referral is coming from us, you really jump on it really quickly. You do everything to get that kid back in school, which is good. But there's always some kind of some glitches here and there. Yeah.
In Prince George's County, access has been called to by the state of Maryland to actually enforce tobacco sales violations to minors. So what happens in Prince George's County is that the county has a compliance officer, or a compliance officer, who goes out and files citations against vendors who sells tobacco products to underage patrons. What we're doing is we've acquired that list of violators, and we're going back to those violators and provide them additional education to make sure that they never violate again, or at least inform us if their violations are still, if they're still violating, and then we report them to the compliance officer. As of right now, the county has visited about close to 600, about 580 vendors who sell tobacco products, and of those 580, they might have issued probably about 70 citations. First citation is a $300 fine. Second one is a $1,000 fine, and third one, you may be penalized by having your license suspended or expelled as far as selling tobacco products. So the state of Maryland has asked us to visit 100 vendors to make sure that they are compliant. And what we're doing, again, just to make sure that our most least compliant vendors are actually doing what they're supposed to do. We actually are visiting them of a higher priority than the other vendors. So in other words, if you violated twice, you're top of the list to be visited for tobacco education. If you've done it once, you're the next tier down. If you've just gotten a warning, you're the next tier down. And anybody else who has not been visited at all, you're the next tier down. So that's how that's working. We're working in conjunction with the county. It's working very well thus far. We visited about 40 to 50 establishments thus far. Very successful.
What do you actually give them to show that they are in compliance? Is it a certificate, or what do you give them?
Right now, we don't give them anything to show their compliance. They ask. What we do is we go to make sure they have all the things that pertain to that compliance. In other words, do they have the what's your ID insignia, or or just a little piece of cardboard paper they get from the state saying that we ID. They need to have that. They need to have certain products cannot be on the countertop for sales as far as tobacco is concerned. No electronic cigarettes or rolling papers or tobacco are supposed to be on the counter for sale. So those are the things we look for compliance. We hand them a customized brochure that indicates that is indicative of Prince George's County, as well as the state of Maryland, to make sure they know that they have an actual concrete source of information to look through and get information about to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do.